Tātad nākamā stunda par pieredzi pasaulē un dodu vārdu Oliveram Bullough. Please, Oliver, the floor is yours. We are happy you are here. And
it's good to be in Riga. And happy International Anti-Corruption Day. I was walking through the Christmas market yesterday evening looking for some presents for my children, and they were playing Christmas songs loudly from a speaker next to the Christmas tree. And I found myself thinking that we could change the lyrics of I wish it could be Christmas every day to I wish it could be International Anti-Corruption Day every day. I'm a journalist and an author. I moved to Russia 24 years ago, almost exactly, because I had always been interested in Russia. I had no intention of writing about corruption, and in fact, for most of the time I was in Russia, I didn't write about corruption. I wrote about the war in Chechnya, I wrote about human rights abuses, I wrote about the shutting down of independent political parties, all of the usual depressing stories that journalists write about when they're in Russia. But of course, it was impossible to live in Russia and not engage with corruption. If you wanted to go swimming, you had to prove you didn't have congenital diseases, which meant you had to give 500 rubles to a doctor in exchange for a piece of paper saying you didn't have diseases. If you wanted to walk freely down the street, you had to occasionally pay money to police officers so they didn't arrest you on whatever charge they'd originally decided to arrest you on. I once arrived in Sochi on a boat from Turkey and was fined $200 for having a business visa and being in a tourist zone, which I think was the most remarkable example of corruption I ever came across. He'd actually arrested every single man on the ferry, so I can but suppose I was just one of many people who paid the same fine. But I became interested in corruption as a system rather than as an individual annoyance. After the revolution in Ukraine in 2014, of course it was 10 years ago exactly, there were protesters on the Maidan in Kiev protesting because of Viktor Yanukovych's decision to turn his back on association with Europe and move towards accepting more money from the Russians. And it was not much more than 10 years ago when he fled in a helicopter with bags of money and various pieces of artwork, kicking off the crisis that continues to this day. And it was an extraordinary time, the months after February 2014, when for a short period of time, there was a unique opportunity for a journalist to see behind the scenes of the corrupt officials, see what they had spent their money on. Obviously, many of you who've been to Kyiv will have visited Mezhihiria, Yanukovych's palace. It is, Ukrainians tell me, and I have no reason to doubt them, the biggest log cabin in the world. It is 5 stories high. Yanukovych fancied himself as a hunter. He had certificates on the wall saying he was Hunter of the Year. Year after year after year, there was like a whole row of them. He obviously genuinely believed this was a worthwhile compliment. And this place is amazing. He also had a smaller log cabin in a forest outside Kiev. He did hunt. He had an enclosure with a fence around it, and they would bring in wild boars in a truck and put them in an enclosure, and then he would shoot them. They didn't have anywhere to go, obviously, so it wasn't very glorious hunting, but hunting it was. And there was this amazing exhibition in the National Museum in Kiev where all the various treasures that Yanukovych had accumulated, they put them on display, like a particularly weird, immersive art exhibition. There were many different portraits of Yanukovych. There were many different presents he'd been given, including a paperweight that had once belonged to Stalin. There was a Picasso ceramic, and also just huge quantities of hunting things that people had given him, axes, knives, guns, and so on. And this was all very funny, and it was very easy to laugh at Yanukovych and his friends because they had such appalling taste in stuff, houses, log cabins. But it rapidly became clear that Ukrainian corruption isn't just a Ukrainian story. Because so often the money that was stolen from Ukraine didn't stay in Ukraine, it ended up moving through other places, moving through Latvia, moving through Cyprus, and it so often came to London, where at the time I was living. So I became, well, very alarmed by this and very determined to alert people in the UK to this thing that was apparently happening without anyone knowing. It didn't occur to me that it could be happening with everyone knowing, because it was so dreadful that money that was being stolen from Ukraine or from Russia or from Azerbaijan or Nigeria or wherever was all coming to the UK and being spent in the UK openly. Surely that wouldn't be happening if we knew about it. So it struck me as my job as a journalist was to write about this, to alert the British establishment to what was happening, and then the British establishment would stop this happening. So I wrote articles, and surprise, the British establishment did not stop this happening. In fact, everyone just more or less ignored what I was doing. So I wrote a book about it called Moneyland. I didn't change anything. So I wrote another book called Butler to the World, and that didn't change anything either. Butler to the World is a description of the role of the British state, in particular in the City of London, in accepting stolen money from around the world, trying to explain why this happens and how this happens. And I suppose I was thinking when I wrote this book and researched this book that it would make some people very angry, that there would be a real, an outcry to become a political book. That's what I was hoping. That didn't happen at all. In fact, weirdly, it was sort of the opposite of that. It was read widely. It was widely reviewed. At the end of the year when it came out, it had Book of the Year in the Daily Mail, which is on the far right, and the Daily Worker, which is on the far left, and multiple points in between, including the FT, which is right bang in the middle. And it felt like everything I was saying had just been accepted as true without anyone actually doing anything about it. So the book I'm working on now is an attempt to understand why it is that financial crime is so serious and so important, and yet so hard to do anything about. Why can't we stop it? And I think this is a valid question, because often when governments decide to stop things, they can stop them. If you look at the number of people that die in road traffic accidents in the UK, the government decided in the 1970s it was a priority to stop people dying in road traffic accidents, and the number of people that die in road traffic accidents has fallen by about 80%. The same is true all across the European Union. Governments brought in seatbelts and airbags and all the other safety stuff, and now there are far fewer people die in road traffic accidents. There are still some, but far, far fewer. And yet, if you look at the first known estimate of the volume of money being laundered around the world, which was made in the late 1990s by the head of the International Monetary Fund, he said that between 2 and 5% of global GDP is laundered every year. It was a guess, and I know one of the people who was with him when they made the guess, and they came up with the number in the lift on the way down to the conference. This is not a rigorously researched or supported number, but no one disagrees that it's probably about right. The number that people say now for how much money is laundered all around the world is between 2 and 5% of global GDP. 25 years have passed. The world has passed law after law. There have been multiple rounds of FATF, mutual evaluations. Latvia has been criticised. Latvia has cleaned up, and yet nothing apparently has changed. In fact, not only has nothing changed, but the situation is far, far worse because the world economy is so much bigger than it was in 1998. Helpfully, the size of the global economy is approximately $100 trillion right now. So even I can do the mathematics and tell you that. That means that the amount of money that is being laundered annually is between 2 and 5 trillion US dollars every year. Now, I struggle with numbers, very large numbers, of understanding quite what they mean. $2 trillion, if you had $2 trillion in a pile of $2 trillion bills, and you settled down to count them $1 a second until you were finished, that would take you about 70,000 years. It's a huge amount of money, and that's the lower round of the estimate. $5 trillion would take you a little bit longer even than that. So if so much money is being stolen, and we all know that this money, every single one of those dollars has been taken from someone who needs it and has been taken by someone who doesn't need it, and many of the people who are taking it, who are living not so far away from here, are truly appalling people. And yet we are not able to stop them doing what they're doing. There has to be a pretty good reason for why that is. And so that's what my new book is about. And, I mean, I don't need to tell you in Latvia that money laundering is a complicated business. It is hard to uncover what is happening. It is hard often to understand what is happening, how it is being done. So as is the case with my previous books, I found it far easier to go back to the beginning, to look at how things were when the world was less complicated, because you can see the dynamics in place in a far simpler and easier to understand way. And to go back to the beginning, in the case of fighting money laundering, means to go back to 1980, to Florida, because that is where the world began tackling money laundering. Money laundering has always existed, of course, but the first law against it was passed in 1970, the Bank Secrecy Act in the United States, and the first concerted American law enforcement effort was 1980. They called it Operation Greenback, because Americans always have absolutely fantastic names for their operations. Why Florida? Well, Florida was not exactly being subtle about the fact that it was a center of the criminal economy. As you may know, the Federal Reserve, the American central bank, has multiple branches in different American cities. There is a San Francisco Fed, a New York Fed. There is also a Miami Fed. Every year, the Central Federal Reserve in Washington sends out banknotes to all the other branches because, you know, there are always banknotes get used, they get lost, they get damaged, they need to be replaced. So there is always a flow of money out of Washington which gets printed to other branches of the Federal Reserve so it can go out from banks and be used by ordinary people. That was the case in 1979 everywhere except Miami. Miami did not require banknotes. Instead, it returned $5 billion worth of banknotes every year to the center because so much cash was being paid into banks in Miami, which was the fruits of organized crime, primarily at the time, the drugs trade. So money laundering in Miami in 1980 was not subtle. I've been speaking to detectives who were involved at the time, and the stories they tell are hilarious in terms of the sheer obviousness of what was happening. In order to launder money in Miami in 1980, you took a box of banknotes into a bank, you handed it to the bank, and you were done. I had one particularly entertaining story that I heard of they were observing a bank that they suspected was involved in money laundering. And every day a car would arrive and with a courier in it who would go into the bank because he had so many boxes of banknotes he couldn't carry them on his own. And he would ask the bank security guard to come out and help him. And the security guard would come out with a trolley and they would load it up with boxes and take them into the bank. Except on this one day, the car was stolen while the courier was in the bank. And he came out and said, "Oh, I've stolen my car." And the security guard said, "Oh, shall I call the police?" He goes, "No, don't worry. Just call me a taxi. I'll be back tomorrow." Losing an occasional car was just the cost of doing business in Miami, even if it was full of banknotes. So what did the federal government do about this? Well, what the money launderers were doing was illegal because if you had a transaction of more than $10,000, you had to report it to the authorities. And they were not reporting all of these transactions as considerably more than $10,000. So, but because of the intervention launched by the IRS and the FBI and the Miami Police Department, the banks started reporting all of these transactions in huge numbers, which meant the money launderers didn't want to pay their money into the banks anymore in the way they'd been doing it before. So did that solve money laundering? No. Spoiler, it did not. So what did the money launderers do? Well, they split up this huge amounts of money into packets of slightly less than $10,000, and they paid them into the banks, multiple different banks, in order to evade this particular restriction. Now, many of you may have heard the term in money laundering, smurfing. Smurfing is what you call it when you break up a transaction into smaller amounts in order to evade restrictions. This is when the term smurfing was created because the two of the detectives had children who were big fans of the television program, the cartoon Smurfs, which you may know as these little blue guys with white hats who spend their days running around not doing anything. And so the detectives just saw all of these money couriers running around all day, not doing anything, going in and out of banks, and they thought they looked like the Smurfs. Not because they were blue, but because they weren't doing anything, so they became known as Smurfs, which they are known as to this day. Weirdly, the Smurfs actually originate in French. It's French, they're called Schtroumpfs in French, but French people call money laundering couriers Smurfs rather than Schtroumpfs, because they say calling them Schtroumpfs sounds stupid, which means that they haven't really noticed that calling them Smurfs also sounds pretty stupid. So anyway, the regulations changed, Smurfing became also illegal, and that became cracked down on. Did that solve money laundering? Spoiler, no, it didn't. The money launderers realized that the solution was to put their money in jets, fly out of Miami, the very short journey over the water to the Bahamas, or the Cayman Islands, or Anguilla, or the British Virgin Islands, or Panama, or any of the other jurisdictions, which were very, very close to the United States that did not have the same legal system as the United States. This was a bit more of a problem, but there was also a solution to this, and this is why we gained, in the 1980s, United Nations Treaty Against Money Laundering, and then in 1989, at the G7 meeting in Paris, we gained the Financial Action Task Force, the global task force to end financial crime. And that has had an amazing impact. Globally, all the countries go around assessing each other, checking how well they're doing on tackling money laundering. All of the financial institutions now have compliance departments who check how well they're doing tackling money laundering. Compliance is a $274 billion a year industry, according to the latest estimates. This is an amazing effort being put in to stop money laundering. Is it stopping money laundering? No, it isn't. There is still 2 to 5% of global GDP being laundered, despite the efforts in 1980 in Florida and despite the efforts everywhere else that are happening now. So that's what interests me. Why, if all this effort is being done, if all the governments in the world are determined to stop this problem, is the problem not being stopped? Now, one of the things that my friends and I like to do when we have spare time and a desire to do it is organise what we call the London Kleptocracy Tours. London Kleptocracy Tours are very loosely modelled on Hollywood bus tours. In Hollywood, you can get a bus tour and people will point out houses that belong to film stars or that used to belong to film stars as a recognition of the glamour and wonder of Tinseltown. In London, we have a similar situation, just we don't have film stars living in London, we have kleptocrats. So we put people in a bus and we drive them around West London. We point out houses that belong to Russian oligarchs and Nigerian regional governors and Angolan politicians' daughters and all the other guests of our fair city. Now, it has been interesting watching as attention has come on London and its role as a centre of kleptocracy. It has been interesting watching how the kleptocrats have responded to this. Now, I'm not going to claim it is our London Kleptocracy Tours that have been the main driver of this dynamic. I think we are the funniest response to the London kleptocracy problem, but we're also probably the least relevant. But there has been, despite the British establishment's desire to welcome as much money into our country as possible, there have been sporadic efforts to stop money being laundered too obviously in London. And the kleptocrats have responded to that in exactly the same way as the money launderers responded to the efforts of the FBI and the IRS in Florida in the early 1980s. So initially, the first Russian kleptocrats who came and bought property in London after 1991 just bought it directly and openly in the sort of property equivalent of turning up at a bank with a box full of banknotes. I've spoken to an estate agent who actually ran the first trade. It was literally some money was transferred to London, house was bought in the guy's own name, and everyone was happy. But gradually, it became increasingly clear that not all of the money coming out of Russia was honestly obtained. There were scandals like the Bank of New York scandal, Mabetek scandal, and so on in the 1990s. And it started to look like the Russians needed to perhaps obscure what they were doing. So they started hiding their ownership of property via shell companies registered in offshore jurisdictions. And that was a very successful way of hiding what they were doing for a while. But gradually the authorities started to notice this was happening and started to try and stop it, not so much because they were worried about kleptocratic cash, but more because they were worried about tax avoidance and tax evasion. So about a decade ago, the British government made it much less attractive to use shell companies to own property in London. Did that stop Russian kleptocrats buying property in London? No, it did not. Instead, they changed from using shell companies to using trusts, which are a far more opaque instrument where they just have a relationship with a lawyer in a tax haven rather than having a company in a tax haven. And now it is impossible to see who owns the property. We are in England and Wales. In fact, the number of shell companies owning property has gone down in the last 10 years from about 100,000 to about 90,000. The number of trusts owning property have, however, gone up to about 250,000. So the problem is very much not solved. Once again, the money launderers have responded to the efforts we've taken to try to stop money laundering and have just carried on regardless. Now, this is a fairly depressing message to bring to a country like Latvia. Latvia has, I don't think I'm breaking any news here to say that Latvia used to be a significant part of the problem. And it is really good to see the efforts that Latvia has made to drive dirty money out of the country, to stop being part of the problem and instead become part of the solution. But there is a real problem here, which is, of course, Latvia is significantly big enough to be part of the problem, but is not big enough to be the solution. Right? So what is the challenge? Because if Latvia stops moving money, then perhaps it can go via payment service providers in a country quite nearby, or it perhaps can go via banks in Dubai or banks in Singapore or wherever. And if money is being laundered anyway, why bother trying to stop it? That's the question that underlies everything. If it's very difficult to do anything about, if the criminals always adjust, you may as well not bother. I have a friend called Jason Sharman, who is a professor at Cambridge University, who thinks this about the global compliance industry. He says if we're spending $274 billion on compliance and achieving absolutely nothing, we may as well just not bother spending the $274 billion and just give up altogether. He's joking, but only joking a little. So I think the problem here is that we tend to think about money laundering in completely the wrong way. I said at the beginning, when governments seek to solve a problem like road traffic accidents, they tend to be able to solve it. But road traffic accidents and money laundering are fundamentally different problems. Road traffic accidents is an engineering problem. If you can make cars better, cars safer, then you can reduce road traffic accidents. That isn't what's happening with money laundering. Money laundering is not an engineering problem. You can't just change the pipes that the money flows through and solve the problem. It is a human nature problem, which is that humans are greedy. We like stealing money, and if we steal it, we like to keep it, and if you want to keep it, you have to launder it. And so there will always be demand for money laundering. So why do we bother trying to fight it? Well, that's a really interesting question, actually. I did a talk in a school about 5 years ago about money laundering, and talking to schools is far more scary than talking in a group like this, because you never quite know what children are going to come out with. And at the end of it, one of the kids put his hand up and said, yeah, if you know all this about money laundering, why don't you just go and do it? Which was slightly insulting, and suggested that perhaps he hadn't very much enjoyed my talk. But it was a really good question, and I think about it like every day. What is the answer to that question? Because it's the question that confronts all of us, right? What's the point of trying to stop money laundering if it's going to happen anyway? Why don't we just go and do it? And there was, in Florida, inevitably, because it's always Florida, there was a professor who was an expert in money laundering who got arrested for money laundering. And, I think many of us have studied money laundering. We can sympathize with that because you may as well, right? No one else apparently cares, so why not just cash in? But the reason is that the world would be much better if there wasn't money laundering. That's just a fact. The world would be much better if Putin and his friends did not get to steal all the money they want, launder it into the West, buy property and use it to bribe and undermine Western political processes and democracy. The world would be better without that. The world would be better without human trafficking, and it would be better without fentanyl. It would be better without all of these problems. Now, there will always be criminals who want to do these things, but we don't need to make life easy for them. And so I think the way to understand money laundering is that crime can be profitable, right? And the way to stop it is to take the profit out of crime. And the more expensive we make it to launder money, the less profitable crime will become. So therefore, you can never erase crime altogether, but you can reduce it by making it less profitable. And that, I think, is what Latvia has done. You have managed to introduce an impediment to the flow of money. And that's a really important thing to do. Because back in Florida in 1980, it's possible to laugh at the extreme obviousness of money laundering back then. But it is more expensive to have to break huge packages of money up into little bags of $9,900 and launder them all individually. That is more expensive. It requires more people. And it did take the profit out of the more egregious forms of crime. It costs more money to put your cash in a jet and fly it to the Bahamas than it does just to take it to the First National Bank of Miami and pay it straight in across the counter. So by tackling money laundering that way, they were succeeding. It's possible to look at it and say, well, the money got laundered anyway, so it was a pointless activity. But that's to ask the question in the wrong way. Because the only way that you can tackle money laundering is by making it more annoying for people to launder money. And that is the ambition that we all have. So the message for this is that tomorrow, International Anti-Corruption Day, is that having succeeded in Latvia, or having progressed in Latvia, so you no longer move all of the money for the Russians, don't just look around the world and think, well, that was stupid because now Dubai is doing it. Please go to Dubai and tell them how you did it and tell them to stop as well. Because if they stop, then eventually it will be even harder for the Russians to move money. And then maybe Turkey will stop as well. And then eventually, who knows, maybe even London will stop. I mean, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, but maybe one day. All I can say is thank you for listening. Thank you for doing what you've done. Thank you for not giving up because it's pointless, because it isn't pointless. It's really important. Thanks very much.